Hi, so this video is going to be about graphing, and in order for me to show you all you need to know about graphing, first let's look at timelines. So as you can see here, I have a timeline set up. We start at 0 right here at this little dot, and then as time moves forward, which is represented by this arrow going to the right, as time moves forward, we have these increments of time. We have like 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, and so on. And I just randomly stopped at 10 hours, but as you can tell by the arrow, it can go up to infinite amount of time. And so if you want to look at a timeline, let's say you went on a road trip and 2 hours into the road trip, you stopped and refilled your gas tank. So let's put a little dot at the 2 for 2 hours. And then after you filled up your gas tank at 2 hours, and then you got back on the road, and 2 hours later you stopped, you had to go to the bathroom because when you stopped to get gas, you also got a big soda. So now, 2 more hours in, which is 4 hours, you stopped and went to the bathroom and you got some candy or whatever. And then you stayed on the road for 3 more hours, 1, 2, 3, and then you got to your grandma's house. So it took a total of 7 hours to get to your grandma's house on your road trip, driving across the country. So if we want to connect these dots, we would start at the 0 because you started at 0 time, and we would just draw a straight line through all of these, and we would stop when you stopped your road trip at 7 hours. Okay, so simple enough. So we have the timeline. We have 0 over here at the left, starting it, and then it goes infinitely over in increments of hours. And this doesn't have to be hours. This could be minutes. If it only took you 7 minutes to get to your grandma's house and you stopped twice, you stopped somewhere at 2 minutes and 4 minutes. It doesn't matter. It can be anything. So time. So this would be a timeline. Now let's take a look at an amount line. An amount line it's the same thing as a timeline. As you can see, we start at 0 down here, and it goes infinitely, it gets infinitely increased, the amount of something. And you can tell by this arrow, it can go up as high as it needs to. So let's say on your road trip, when you stopped and filled up your tank of gas, you spent $6 on putting gas in your car. Don't we all wish it would only cost $6 to fill up our tank? But say you spent $6, so we're going to put a 6 right there. And then when you stopped to get a candy bar, you spent $2. So we're going to mark a 2 down here. Down at the 2, you spent $2 for a candy bar and some soda. And so this is going to be your amount line. And as you can tell, it's not necessarily in any order. You wouldn't say you spent $6 and then you spent $2 more on your candy bar, so that gives you 8. We wouldn't do that. We would just mark every time you spent some money, we would mark how much money it is. So we have $2 down here for the candy bar and $6 up here for putting gas in your car. And so that would be an amount line. Now, so as you can see, this amount line, it doesn't really give us all that much information. This is just how much money we spent. But it doesn't give us that much information like when did we spend the $2? When did we spend the $6? It doesn't have any time linked to it because remember time would be going this way. So it doesn't have any time linked to it. So it's just 2 dots on a chart, one saying that you spent $2, another saying that you spent $6 at some point. We don't know any more information about that. So when you're graphing, we're able to put that time and the amount together so it tells us a story. So what if we could put these values together and tell some kind of story about it instead of just, a dots on a timeline going like this, and you got 2 hours here, 4 hours here, and 7 hours here, 2, 4, 7, or the amount that you spent going like here. We had $6 up here and $2 here for your candy bar. What if we could put these together and tell some kind of a story of how much money you spent over time, over this time that we have? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a timeline again. So we're going to put 0 down here and put our line. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we're going to use the same 0 as our point, our 0 point, and we're going to draw our amount line up like this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to have our time down here in hours, and we're going to have the money we spent going this way, up. So now we can actually tell a story with these values, and we want to look at the time first, and the first time we have here is 2 hours. 2 hours into your road trip, you stopped and filled up your gas tank. So we're going to go over 1, 2, and here's the 2 on your timeline, but we're not going to put a dot there. We're going to look over at our other value, our amount value, the money spent, and we spent $6 to fill up our tank. So here's our amount line. So we're going to go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and here's our 6. But we're not going to put a dot there either. What we're going to do is we're going to put a dot up where the 6 is, but we're going to count over this 1, 2 for our time. We're going to have an invisible timeline up here, and here's our 2 hours, because see, this goes down. This is supposed to be a straight line. This goes down and matches the 2 hours that we have labeled. So here is where we're going to put our dot. So at 2 hours, we spent $6. Now we're going to look at our next pit stop that we did on the road trip, and that was 4 hours in. So down here at the timeline, we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. At 4 hours, we stopped again because we had to go to the bathroom and we got a candy bar. But we're not going to put a dot there. Before we put a dot, we're going to look up at our values, and we're going to see that at that time, at 4 hours into the road trip, we spent $2. We spent $2 on a candy bar. So we're going to go up 1, 2, like it's our amount line, because see, this line should go all the way over to where the 2 is. $2 spent. And so where these two meet, this is where we're going to put our dot. We're going to put our dot at 4 hours in. We spent $2. So at 4 hours in, we spent $2. And where those two lines meet, we're going to put a dot there. And then finally, at 7 hours into the road trip, you arrived at your grandma's house. So you didn't spend any money then. You were at grandma's house and she made you a nice dinner and you didn't have to spend any money. So on your timeline, We're going to go all the way over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and here's 7 hours. We arrived at Grandma's house, but we didn't spend any money. So we're still at the zero. We're still in the zero part of the amount line. So that's where we're going to put our dot. We're going to put our dot down here on the bottom on the zero part of the amount line because we spent $0 at 7 hours. So now we have these three dots and we can take a line and connect these three dots. So that's going to give us this graph. And let me erase this other stuff. That's going to give us this graph of your road trip and how much money you'd spent on your road trip. At 2 hours, you had spent $6. You had spent $2 at 4 hours, and you spent nothing at 7 hours. So now let's go on to a graph paper and we'll see how this applies to other values. Now here is a common problem you'll find in math. It says the table below shows how quickly a beaker of water was heated up using a Bunsen burner. So a Bunsen burner is just one of those things in chemistry. It looks like a candle and you light it and it has a flame coming out of the top of it. So a beaker of water, they just put a beaker of water over it, just like you would boil water over the flame of your stove at home. So this whole thing reads, the table below shows how quickly a beaker of water was heated up using a Bunsen burner. So heated up, that's going to be this temperature column, obviously, because we're talking about heat. So that's going to be the temperature. And it also says the table below shows how quickly. So how quickly, that has to do with time, doesn't it? How quickly something happens. So that's going to be your time column. So when we go to graph this, your time is going to start with 0 and it's going to go this way. And your temperature is going to be your amount line, and it's going to start at the same 0 point, but it's going to go up this way. And we're going to do this on graph paper. So here are your values. At 0 minutes, when you first started, the temperature of the water was 10 degrees Celsius. After 1 minute, the temperature of the water was 20 degrees Celsius. After 2 minutes, the temperature was 30 degrees Celsius, and so on. So we're going to take these values and we're going to plot them on graph paper and make a graph out of it. So here's your graph paper. And the first thing we need to do is we're going to go down to the bottom, near the bottom of the graph, and we're going to make a timeline. And we're going to start with 0. So I'm going to circle this little nexus point, this point where these lines make a cross. So we're going to make this point where these lines cross your 0 point. And then we're going to use this line and we're going to carefully try to make a straight line following this graph paper line. We're going to go over to the right. And I usually draw a little arrow to show that this can go on indefinitely. And so this is going to be your time. So let's label this. Always label your graphs so you know what it is you're graphing and where to do it. So this is going to be your time, and in this case, it's going to be in minutes. So let's take a look at this timeline and see what we can do to make increments of minutes. Let's take, I'm going to change colors and make this blue. And every 2 squares where the blue line is a little darker, we're going to make that a minute. So I'm just going to put marks here. So these are going to be your minutes. So these are your minutes. And this is just random. There isn't any rule about 2 squares equal a minute. I'm just using it because then it's it's wide enough to see, and the graph will be big enough to see. If we used the little tiny individual squares for minutes, we'd be all crammed over into one corner. So I'm just trying to spread it out a little bit. So this is going to be 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6, and so on. And I think the chart only goes up to 10 minutes, but as you can see, time is infinite, so this could go on forever if we wanted it to. Now we're going to make our amount line, and we're going to start at the same place the time started at 0. We only have 1 0. We have to use 0 for both the time and the amount line. And so we're going to draw a straight line up, as straight as we possibly can, following this line on the graph paper. That's why they make graph paper, just so the lines are already there for you, so it's easier to see. But when it's just blank graph paper like this, you need to actually make your border. So this is going to be your amount, and the amount that we're measuring in this case is going to be temperature. So always label your graph. Always label your timeline, what your time is going to be measured in, minutes, hours, seconds, and always label your amount, what your amount is that you're measuring. So this is going to be temperature in degrees Celsius. And let's do the same thing for temperature. And temperature on the chart, if you remember, they counted by tens. So we're going to take these every 2 blue squares, and we're going to make that 10. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So let's write this in. We got 10 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, 30 degrees Celsius, and so on. Okay, so now we have our timeline going this way and our amount line going up this way. We have that all set up, and it's labeled and it's marked, and so now we're ready to go and actually graph this. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at our values here. We have our time values, and then we have our corresponding amounts, and that's going to be our corresponding numbers that go up. So let's start with the first set. We have 0 minutes and 10 degrees Celsius. So on the timeline going to the right, we have 0 minutes. So we're going to start at that 0 I drew, which is the very beginning of the timeline. So we have 0 minutes here, and the amount was 10 degrees Celsius. So if we go up to this 10 degrees Celsius, we can make a dot there. So it's going to be over the 0 minutes and at the 10 degrees Celsius amount line on the amount line going up. Now let's look at the next set of values. We have 1 minute and 20 degrees Celsius. At 1 minute on the timeline, we're going to have 20 degrees Celsius. So we're not going to make a dot on the timeline. We're going to go up until it's even with this 20 degrees Celsius here. So we're going to make a dot, a big dot right here where these two meet. So at 1 minute, it's 20 degrees Celsius. And let me erase these other dots so you don't get confused. Okay, so now we have our 1 dot at 0 time and 10 degrees Celsius, and then we have a dot at 1 minute at 20 degrees Celsius. Now our next one is at 2 minutes on our timeline. It's going to be 30 degrees Celsius on our amount line.
So at 2 minutes on our timeline, we're going to go up to where it meets the 30 degrees Celsius on our amount line. So if you look down here, this lines up with our 2 minutes on our timeline, but if you look over here to the left, this lines up with our 30 degrees Celsius on our amount line. So now let's go back to our values table, and our next value is 3 minutes, and at 3 minutes, what's the amount? The amount is 50 degrees Celsius. So at 3 minutes, we have 50 degrees Celsius. So going back to our graph, at 3 minutes on our timeline, we're going to go up to where it says 50 degrees Celsius on our amount line. Now let's go back and look at our next set of values. At 4 minutes, it has 60 degrees Celsius. So going back to our graph, we go up to the 4 minutes on our timeline and up to the 60 degrees Celsius. Now let's go back, and on our time it has 5 minutes and 60 degrees Celsius again. And this happens when you're plotting, when you're graphing numbers. Sometimes the numbers act weird and unexpected, and that's fine. So at 5 minutes, it's also at 60 degrees Celsius. So let's go and see what that looks like on our graph. So at 5 minutes on our timeline down here, it's going to be 60 degrees Celsius. So that dot is going to be even with our previous dot at 4 minutes, 60 degrees Celsius. See how they're even between them? But one is at 4 minutes and the other one is at 5 minutes. Now going back to our values, we have 6 minutes on our timeline, and at 6 minutes on our timeline, the amount is going to be 70 degrees Celsius. So we're going to go to our graph, and at 6 minutes on our timeline, we're going to go up to 70 degrees Celsius. So our dot's going to be right there. So now at 7 minutes, our temperature, our amount line is going to be 80 degrees Celsius. So at 7 minutes on our timeline, we're going to go up to 80 degrees Celsius and make a dot right there. Now at 8 minutes, we're going to also have 80 degrees. So the temperature didn't change that time. So at 8 minutes on the timeline, we're also going to have a dot on the same amount line as 80 degrees. So those two are going to be even. Just one's going to be in the 7 minutes and the other one's going to be in the 8 minutes. Now our next set of values is at 9 minutes. The temperature is 90 degrees Celsius. So let's go over to our graph, and at 9 minutes on our timeline, we're going to go up to 90 degrees Celsius, which is right here. And then finally on our values, at 10 minutes, the temperature is going to reach 100 degrees Celsius. So we go over to 10 minutes on our timeline and all the way up to 100 degrees Celsius. Because see, if you look over, this is on the same line as 100 degrees. Okay, so I've managed to erase all of those extra dots, or most of those extra dots that I made. So we just have the big fat green dots that we made plotting this graph. So remember, the first big green dot is on the 0 line, on the amount line, because at the time was 0. At 0 minutes was when we started. So we started on this line, the amount line right here at the 0 minutes. And let me change that back to green. Okay. So now we have all these green dots and it tells a story. It tells over a matter of time what the temperature, how the temperature increased in this beaker of water. So now we can take a line and connect all of these dots. All you're doing is connecting the dots in order. So we're going to do it in order of the time. So we'll start here at the 10. And try to connect them as straight as you can. If you're doing this on graph paper with just a pencil, you might want to use a ruler so you get your lines straight. But anyway, so that's our graph. That's going to be our graph of heating up water in a beaker over a Bunsen burner over a series of 10 minutes. Here's the 10 minutes down here. And that's how we're going to graph this. Now, the other thing that you need to know about graphing, now that we've gotten this out of the way, just how to do it, is just a little bit of terminology of what we call things. Now, I've been calling this our timeline down here. So the one that starts and goes to the over to the right, I've been calling this our timeline because it's easiest to explain it when you're talking about time. And the one that goes up, I've been calling this our amount line because it's easiest to explain it because, you know, you're just talking about amounts of things. But there's actually a technical terms for these lines, and those are the timeline is going to be your x-axis. So each of these lines are called an axis, A-X-I-S. So the timeline is actually called your x-axis. So the x is the one that goes to the right. So the x goes to the right, like that. And your amount line, the one that goes up, that's going to be called your y-axis. So your y is the one that goes up. Okay, so anytime you see x, y values when you're graphing something, all they're talking about is, if they're talking about your x value, they're talking about where it's at on the timeline from left to right. If they're talking about your y values, they're just talking about where it's at on the amount line going up and down. So if we go back to our table, this time column that we have, these would be your x values. And these amounts, these would be called your y values. And the axis is the actual line that you draw on the graph that either goes left to right or up and down. And you plot the x values, your time, on the left to right on your x-axis that goes left to right, and you plot your amounts, your y values, on this y-axis that goes up and down. So this is just the terminology that we use when we graph, but it's just a basic concept of your timeline and your amount line going up. But it's called your x-axis and your y-axis.